hours, so 24/7. So if you feel like talking about gold and silver or other related topics, including this one, please check back to the room and just come back and visit. As I mentioned, it's 24 hours, so why don't you just take this time right now to just click and become a member and visit often. Before I introduce our guest, I just wanted to talk about preparedness. And something that I've noticed in my generation and in society in general is that we really rely too much on government to provide us with basic essentials. And it's this dependency that puts us in a precarious position in the event of any disaster. And we can all recall Hurricane Katrina. And the one thing that stands out in my mind is that many people just sat there and did nothing and waited to see what would happen. And this is precisely the wrong mindset to have when you're heading into a possible hyperinflation situation or other disaster situation. And as well, for thousands of years, so in every epoch, every society, every philosophy and religion, they have always revered preparedness. And it's just an essential fundamental of life. And I mean, let's face it, it's just basic common sense. So this is the whole reason why I'd like to do nights like this, and this is the whole reason why I've invited our guest speaker, who I'd like to introduce to you now. Jack Spirko is of the survivalpodcast.com, and I'm going to let him provide all of the detailed information of his background and the history of how he got started in all of this. But I just wanted to say that listening to his Survival Podcast website, I've just learned that it is the best resource available out there on the internet for this type of survival preparedness for disaster to prepare for any kind of a disaster. It doesn't have to be hyperinflation. And his information is detailed and tested, and it's often tested firsthand by Jack himself. So he's just a really genuine person. And the one thing that I've noticed as well is that when you listen to his podcasts, even though you're getting detailed, excellent information on preparedness, quite often you just feel like you're sitting out back on a lawn chair with your good neighbor friend and you're just having a really great conversation, but you're actually learning some amazing things at the same time. So with no further ado, I'd just like to hand over the floor right now to our guest speaker, Jack Spirko.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on tonight, and this is my first time using a room like this, so when I really kick off and go, I'm going to probably talk for about 20 minutes. I'll lock the mic on, so Christy or anybody else, if there's any hang-up during that while I have the mic locked, let me know in the chat room and I'll cut off. And other than that, thank you for having me here, and I just want to make sure everybody can hear me clear before I really kind of start off. Okay, I've got the mic locked on now. It seems like from the chat room, no one came back by verbal, so I've got the mic locked. If anything starts to go haywire at any point, just, let me know in the chat room. I'll be paying attention. And let me, again, thank you for having me here tonight, everybody. I really appreciate that. And I wanted to kind of start out tonight by telling you a little bit about who I am, where I come from, and why I do the things that I do that some people think are, crazy, because survivalists are all these crazy people that live up in the mountains. That's not really true, but, anytime a word comes up, people start to question, the why and the how and the what. I grew in kind of a mixture between the swamps of Florida for part of my youth and the Appalachian Mountains in Pennsylvania for another part. So I spent a lot of time outdoors. I have an affinity for that. I also grew up in kind of I wouldn't call it in poverty, but a poor family, a family that was always below what the government would call the poverty level, though as a child I never really knew. I never understood that because we seemed like we had everything. And as I, grew up and got, a little bit older and went off, I joined the Army for a few years and came back from that, and then left my small town in the Appalachian region of Pennsylvania and went off and came to Dallas, Texas, where I still live today, and started working on building that thing they call the American dream. And I did a pretty good job. I went from In 1993, when I first came here, I started out packing boxes in a warehouse for $6 an hour. And by 1999, I was earning six figures, and still have to this day never taken one college class. So that's an example of what the American dream can be for people. But I also started living what I call the American nightmare, and it took me quite a few more years before I figured out that's what I was. All of a sudden, I had this stuff called money, and I started spending it at levels that really weren't sustainable, even with what I was earning, because it felt good to finally have money. And I thought to myself, I spent my whole life struggling. It's time to reward myself. And, by 2002, my wife and I sat down and looked, and we had over $20,000 worth of credit card debt. We had a couple car payments. We had everything that the American dream entailed, all this debt. Somewhere along this event of September 11th, 2001, and that was kind of my first pause, because I ended up in a hotel room in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with my wife in near Allentown, Pennsylvania, and was unable to get home for 2.5 days because, of course, they shut everything down. And I thought, you're living this life, you have all of this debt, you have all of this worry, all the stress, you put on 15 extra pounds of weight, and I put on more after that. You can see some of my videos of still fight some of that off. And now your family is in pain, they're suffering, they're hurting. My son asked me on the phone if a war could come here, and I had to tell him honestly it just did. And I had all these other things going on in my life, and I thought to myself, what are you doing? So at that point, I kind of started a path back to my roots, as I call it. And it took years for me to really come all the way back around. And it was about 2006 that we really went fully back into my roots and doing all the things that I had done growing up. All the stuff I talk about that we call survivalism today, when I was a kid in the 70s and the 80s in Pennsylvania, we didn't call it survivalism, we called it life. Storing food, valuing things like gold and silver. Don't worry, folks, we're going to talk about that a lot tonight. I remember my grandmother had this little jar of gold coins, and she used to show them to me, and she lived through the gold seizure. And she said, and this was a lady that never cussed, okay? This lady was, never the person to use profanity. And when she would show me these, you know what she would say? These are the ones the sons of bitches didn't get. And that was the type of values that I grew up with. That certain things were to be valued. That if you had a garden and at the end of the year you put away a lot of food, that was something to have pride in because you knew you were going to eat through the winter. And we went back to that. We started looking at our debt, and within 2 years of deciding we will pay off our debt, it was gone. It was paid for in full. And the only thing we have left as debt anymore is a mortgage on a house that will soon be gone as well. We're making a move back to the country. We're moving back up to Arkansas, as some of you that listened to the show after the Christmas season, completely turned our lives around. And why did I spend all this time to give you this background information on me? We're here to learn about hyperinflation, not about me. To give you a frame of reference of where I'm going to come from, because I'm going to tell you some things, and I'm going to answer some of your questions tonight in some ways that you may not be accustomed to. I'm not going to tell you that the solution to every problem that you are going to face in the future is going to revolve around laying up gold and silver, because if that was the case, honestly, we wouldn't have much work to do, would we? We would just take every spare dime we can, burn the precious metals, and put it away. I'm not going to tell you that those percent of your wealth at a minimum should be in gold and or. I think that's very close. I myself do a little bit more than that. If you want to tell me to put 20 or 25% in with that, if you want to do 50, I'm okay with it, but I think you're a little 100%. I think that you're side of the table. So you may hear some things that are different from me than you're used to hearing, and I want you to understand where they come from and why I think that way. I want you to really can definitely say that we're going to experience inflation. We can even say that we're going to at some point experience hyperinflation. What we can't say is exactly when, exactly how that's going to occur, and exactly what will inflate and what won't. We can look at our money and say, based on the way that these, and pardon the expression for anybody that doesn't like some of the words I use, but I can't be me if I don't use certain words. So because of the way that the ass clowns that run our system behave, and I include, for the United States, the Federal Reserve and the central bank of your nation, if you're an international listener, and our politicians, inflation is a guarantee. The devaluation of money is not just something that's going to happen, it's policy, it's the plan. But we have periods of time in between things. And we also have inflationary periods where not everything inflates. We're in one right now. and you would say that there's inflation right now. If you look at the commodity sector, if you look at wheat, if you look at rice, all agricultural goods, if you look at gold and silver, if you look at copper, if you look at anything that we would generally classify as a commodity, it outperformed the stock market this month. And it probably will next month as well. And that's, folks, I want you to realize something. As bad as times seem, we just had a record September for the stock market. And the old pennies, the 1982 and back pennies you have sitting in a jar, just outperformed the stock market in a record September. So we are going to have inflation. But what has not inflated? Your house is not inflated. Housing prices have been almost dead level. In fact, anything that they could look at and say is inflation in the housing market, it's false inflation because there was so much lost that we only have a partial rebound. We're still way under the top in every market. My market down here in Dallas, Texas, because of how much gas they're pulling out of the ground right now and just a strong local economy, we've experienced less deflation than most of the United States, and we still are in a deflationary period for our real estate. And this is how we can't play one card, and hope it's the ace of spades with our plan for the future with hyperinflation or anything else, because you want a roof over your head. And you still got to pay that mortgage. And this is the danger that we get into with property and real property if we don't buy it smart and at the right time and with the right pretext to how much we can actually afford. We get into a situation like now. Right now, I want you to understand that property should be cheaper based on how little is selling, but it's not, and there's a reason, and here's why. The people that are stuck with property can't afford to sell it for less. The people that are holding property that don't need to sell aren't willing to sell it for less. So there's actually a shortage of property, good, solid property at market value right now. And the only way that you can get property in certain environments, especially certain properties, is to overpay for it. To overpay not based on what the property is worth, but to overpay based on what a current appraisal will say that it's worth. And what that means is people can't get loans, because the banks will loan $100,000 by an $80,000 property. If you come up with 40, they'll loan you 60, right? And then, so this is this weird period we're in. We're in this period now where it's gone. The cost of housing really hasn't come down, but the value of the place that we live, that we reside, has dropped. And for many people, that's become a snare or a trap they can't get out. For many people, they're walking away. But what they're finding out is even if they walk away, and even if they do something and finagle the legalities of it, so if a husband and wife, the one partner still retains their credit and they finagle it that way, and they go out to look for a new property, they have to rent, because even though their property wasn't worth what they owed on it, they can't buy it less.